It was therefore no easy matter for Lincoln to leave the Whig Party. Lincoln hated slavery. The persistent and ever-increasing outrages of the exploitation of slaves intensified his hatred. The time had come when he felt the Whig Party should be united in their opposition. Though Clay himself and a majority of his party were opposed to the extension of slavery, there were still pro-slavery men in its ranks in sufficient numbers to prevent a unified party philosophy. On the other hand, while the Democratic Party was overwhelmingly pro-slavery, there were anti-slavery Democrats who, from their numbers, were not to be overlooked. The delicate balance of the North and the South was continually reworked in compromises such as the Missouri Compromise of 1850. Missouri came into the Union as a slave state. The concession of slavery to Missouri was offset by the enactment that all slavery should be forever excluded from the territory west of that state and north of its southern boundary. Stephen Douglas was greatly responsible for the repeal of the Missouri Compromise in 1854. Lincoln was very concerned that the nation was beginning a legislative trend which was allowing states to decide the issue of slavery, and the Whigs Party position was not strong enough for Lincoln. The repeal of the Missouri Compromise caused great excitement throughout the land. The conscience of the anti-slavery portion of the community was shocked, as was also that of the many people who, though not opposed to slavery itself, were opposed to its extension. Illinois was a state divided. The northern part of the state was opposed to slavery, while the southern portion of the state was mostly settled by southern people who favored slavery. To this situation, it must be added that Illinois was the home of Douglas, who was personally and almost solely responsible for the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. He had risen from obscurity to become the most famous man in the United States. His party had a decided majority in the state, and over it, Douglas had absolute control. Douglas lived in Chicago, a city in which the anti-slavery sentiment predominated. When he returned, the public did not support Douglas's position, so a public meeting was planned, at which he was to speak in defense of his own views. A large crowd of approximately 5,000 people gathered. Douglas was surrounded by his own friends, but the major portion of the crowd was intensely hostile to him. When he began to speak, the opposition exploded. He was interrupted by questions and comments. These so exasperated him that he completely lost control of himself. The meeting broke up in confusion. Then came a reaction which greatly profited him. The papers published that he had attempted to speak and had not been allowed to do so, but had been hooted by a turbulent crowd, all of which was true. By the time he spoke again, the sympathy of the public had swung to his side, and he was sure of a favorable hearing. The second speech was at the State Fair in Springfield. Lincoln was in the crowd. His ability as a politician, his growing fame as an attorney and a public speaker, his well-known anti-slavery position singled him out as the one who was the most appropriate to answer the speech of Douglas. Lincoln's political future had taken hold. The first in the series of debates was delivered again at the State Fair in Springfield. Lincoln was present, and it was mentioned by Douglas that he would respond on the following day, October 4th. Douglas was, up to that time, not only the shrewdest politician in the country, but he was acknowledged to be the best debater. He was always prepared on his subject. The following day came Lincoln's reply. As a matter of fairness, he said at the outset that he did not want to present anything but the truth. If he said anything that was not true, he would be glad to have Douglas correct him at once. Douglas, with his customary shrewdness, took advantage of this offer by making frequent interruptions so as to break Lincoln's train of thought. Finally, Lincoln's patience was exhausted, and he paused in his argument to say, "Gentlemen, I cannot afford to spend my time in quibbles. I take the responsibility of asserting the truth myself, relieving Judge Douglas from the necessity of his impertinent corrections." This silenced Douglas, and he spoke without further interruptions to the end of his speech, which was 3 hours and 10 minutes long. The effect of the speech was wonderful. The scene, as described the next day in the Springfield Journal,
is worth quoting. Lincoln quivered with feeling and emotion. The whole House was as still as death. He attacked the bill with unusual warmth and energy, and all felt that a man of strength was its enemy, and he meant to blast it, if he could, by strong and manly efforts. He was most successful, and the House approved the glorious triumph of truth by loud and long continued hurrahs. The speech itself and the manner of its reception angered Douglas. It was far more severe punishment than to be hooted from the stage, as he had been in Chicago. He was handled as he had never been handled in his life. He took the platform and angrily claimed that he had been harassed, and then started to reply. For the next 2 years, Lincoln continued to speak out against slavery. He spoke at the convention of organizing the Republican Party. He addressed the group on May 29, 1856. His speech riveted the crowd. William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, started to take notes for Lincoln during the speech, but stopped. I attempted for about 15 minutes, as was usual with me then, to take notes, but at the end of that time, I threw pen and paper away and lived only in the inspiration of the hour. It was at this time that the Republican Party was born. The Whig Party had been ineffective. Though Henry Clay himself and a majority of his party were opposed to the extension of slavery, there were still pro-slavery men in its ranks in sufficient numbers to prevent any significant anti-slavery platform. A number of newspapers called for a convention, which was really a mass meeting, for there were no accredited delegates at that time. On December 10th, Lincoln spoke at a Republican banquet in Chicago. Once again, his subject was that a free society is not and shall not be a failure. It was this message 4 years later that carried the party to its first victory and made him president. In 1854, Lincoln had been a candidate for the Senate to succeed James Shields, but his party had decided to put Lyman Trumbull in his place. In 1856, he was the logical candidate for governor, but he was of the opinion that the cause would be better served by placing an anti-slavery Democrat in nomination. This was done, and William Bissell was elected. Now, in 1858, the senatorial term of Douglas was about to expire, and a successor would be chosen. Douglas was the candidate of his own party. The Republicans turned naturally to Lincoln. The Republican convention met in Springfield on June 16th, and Lincoln was nominated. He addressed the convention, and his opening words were, "If we could know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to the slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it should become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." The House divided speech was an important speech which Douglas could not ignore. About 3 weeks later, on the 9th of July, Douglas made a speech in Chicago. Lincoln was in the audience. It was unofficially arranged that he should reply. He responded the following evening, A week later, they repeated the same protocol, and shortly after this, Lincoln wrote Douglas a letter proposing a series of joint debates. Douglas was far from enthusiastic, but agreed to do 7 debates. Douglas had all his life experienced great success. He twice missed the nomination for president, but he was still the most formidable man in the Senate. He always traveled in a special car and often on a special train, which was freely placed at his disposal by the Illinois Central Railway. Lincoln traveled by accommodation train, freight train, or wagon as best he could. The two men were physically as diverse. Douglas was known as the Little Giant because he was just over 5 feet tall, and Long Abe was 6 feet 4 inches tall. Their oratory style was equally as forceful. A woman who attended a debate said afterward, "I can recall only one fact of the debate, that I felt so sorry for Lincoln while Douglas was speaking, and then so sorry for Douglas while Lincoln was speaking." The debates were conducted on 7 different evenings, each 3 hours long. Douglas manipulated the first speech. His questions began, "I desire to know whether Lincoln stands today as he did in 1854 in favor of..." Douglas then quoted from the platform of a convention which Lincoln had not attended and which he had nothing to do with. Lincoln complained that Douglas was not conducting the debates fairly. According to Lincoln, Douglas was using a fantastic arrangement of words by which a man can prove a horse chestnut to be a chestnut horse. For the next debate, which was to be at Freeport, Lincoln prepared, among others, the following question: "Can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution?" If this were answered no, it would alienate the citizens of Illinois. If it were answered yes, it would alienate the Democrats of the South. On the way to Freeport, Lincoln met a number of friends and sought their advice. When he read the question to his friends, they advised him to delete that question. "If you do, you can never be senator," to which Lincoln replied, "Gentlemen, I am killing larger game. If Douglas answers, he can never be president, and the Battle of 1860 is worth 100 of this." It is not probable that Lincoln expected to be the nominee of the Republican Party in 1860, but he did see the danger of electing Douglas to the presidency. He was willing to surrender the senatorial election to save the country from a Douglas administration. The sacrifice was made. The prediction proved true. Lincoln lost the senatorship. Douglas lost the presidency. During that time, senators were not elected by the popular vote. The state legislature determined the election by the number of seats a party won. Although Lincoln had the popular vote, the Republican Party failed to win the necessary seats. The reports of the Lincoln-Douglas debates had produced a profound sensation in the West. William Cullen Bryant, the editor of the New York Evening Post, showcased Lincoln in a number of articles. Lincoln continued to speak out against slavery and other issues in the northern states. Up to this point, Lincoln had no aspirations for the presidency, but he did aspire to the United States Senate. He wanted to run again in 1862. But at the beginning of 1860, Lincoln's name had been placed in nomination in the Illinois Republican State Convention at Decatur. A second Republican National Convention met in Chicago on May 16, 1860. The most prominent candidate for the nomination was William H. Seward of New York. He had a long political career. It seemed a foregone conclusion that he would be nominated. The next prominent name was Lincoln. He had the full delegation of Illinois, the first and only choice of the state. He began to be seen as Seward's rival. There was a great deal of politicking going on in the smoke-filled rooms, and Lincoln was nominated on the third ballot. Hannibal Hamlin, the Maine senator, a former Democrat, was nominated for vice president. In June, the Democrats met in Baltimore and, after numerous debates, nominated Douglas of Illinois for president and Herschel Johnson, a Georgia Unionist, for vice president. Both parties campaigned vigorously, and on November 6th, the nation went to the polls and proclaimed Abraham Lincoln president. He had carried every northern state